So, so just to give a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going, I've got two lessons, including today, and then after, but will be this Sunday, and then and then next Sunday will be the last one in this particular series, and then after that, we start the new series, which will have different teachers. Right, which I'm really excited about that. So that will start in 2 weeks. Um, I'm going to sort of finish off today with our exploration of reading Genesis in light of the Holocaust, and then next week I'm going to do a special edition on the book of Exodus, um, because the book of Exodus has a whole different series of not often examined scriptures. And so I want us to take an opportunity to at least look at some of those. And then after that, we'll be finished, and then we'll move on to the next thing. So, kind of as a little review and an introduction to what we're going to talk about today, the whole point of the series really is to use the the events of the Holocaust um, as a reading lens or a reading sensitivity um, for Scripture. In other words, what difference does it make when we keep events like the Holocaust in mind when reading Scripture? And even though we're using the Holocaust, as I started off the class by saying, there are many, 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 many uh, humanitarian disasters that are happening now, that could also be used as well as a way of looking at how those events, what do they illuminate in Scripture? What do they call our attention to? What issues of being human and treating each other correctly and rightly as individuals, as communities, as nations. So I'm aware that there's a lot of different events that we could use. I'm using the Holocaust because that's my area of research, and that is particularly because I'm an Old Testament scholar. Um, I'm very aware that what we call the Old Testament was first and foremost, and still is, Jewish scripture. And so the way in which Jewish scripture is read in Jewish circles, writ very, very broadly, is impacted by the Jewish experience of the Holocaust. And so there's a connection there with being sensitive in the base case to realizing that what we have and what we call the Christian Bible is very, very Jewish in its roots, in its origin. When I say Jewish, I'm not talking about a monolith, because there are many, many different types of Judaism, just like there's many different types of Christianity. Um, but I'm drawing throughout this series, even though I don't necessarily make it explicit, I'm drawing on a lot of research that has been done, particularly in the Holocaust and its intersection with theology, particularly in Eastern and Western Europe, and also from the ways in which the Holocaust is memorialized and remembered today, really in centers across the world, right? I bring that up today because one of the things that we're going to look at in this particular lesson today is the issue of denial, and what that means, and what that illuminates. It illuminates some really interesting things, I think, when we look at the book of Genesis. So, when we talk about the issue of denial, What we're really talking about is the attempt to erase a person or group of people or an event as if they have never existed, right? It's an attempt to wipe out, but it's more than just simply lying about the past or not telling the truth about the past. It's an attempt to eradicate people as if they never existed or to pretend that an event never existed. It's erasing the humanity of someone in the sort of in the broadest sense, or treating people as if they are less than human. So in the in the world of Holocaust studies, there is a gentleman, Dr. Gregory Stanton, who worked for the United States government, was an attaché in Cambodia during the Khmer Rouge, during that particular genocide in the 1970s. He's had a number of appointments um, throughout his career, and through that work, he developed, based on his experience and observation, what has been accepted more generally as the 10 stages of genocide, which are pretty consistent if we look at all the different genocides that have happened, um, say in the last century, across the world, across cultures. These 10 things are generally follow one another. And, basically it starts with classifying people into groups, marking their differences with symbols, discriminating against them. That discrimination leads to dehumanization, which then leads to organization of people, polarization of society, to then persecute eventually and exterminate. The last stage, which is one that he actually added later, the 10 is a revision from the original 8, was this one of denial, right? That he recognized that one of the actual final pieces of the strategy to eradicate people is, once you've done it, to make it seem like it never happened, right? So it's erasing evidence, right? Just getting rid of it. Um, and he recognized that as really integral to the project of extermination, of wiping people out, is to do it in such a way that people don't even realize that it happened, and future generations will not remember it or have a means to remember it. Um, and so we're going to talk about erasure today, right? The idea of erasing. And what I hope to show, or at least get us to think about, is there are places in Scripture where it looks like erasing is happening, but the Bible has a very unique way of being sure that that doesn't actually happen, right? There are guardrails, and I want us to notice what they are, right, within Scripture, because I think it's really a really very interesting feature of the way the actual Scripture is put together. And I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. I do want to bring up two instances, probably two of the most, I mean, all of it's bad, but two of the things that are easy to see is the Treblinka Killing Center, which is not one that's talked about. Usually when we think of the killing centers and extermination camps, we think of Auschwitz, right? That's sort of the big one. But the other one that killed, the numbers vary, but it's at least 900,000 people. A lot of people put it closer to 1 million. But at the Treblinka, which is in eastern Poland, it's about 2.5 hours east of Warsaw. I'm going to use the figure 925. It's about an average. Um, that many people killed in 15 months. right? Mostly Poles. This is one of the pictures that I took the last time I was there. This is the actual site. And what you see is is a forest with a clearing, because in 1943 and 1944, an attempt was made to tear everything down, eradicate all of the evidence, bury all of the bodies, get rid of everything so that no one would even know that it existed. What we have, what you see when you go there are these stones. There's about 1,900 of them that commemorate places where the people were from. What's interesting is that, with one exception, there are no names, um, which is interesting because the memorial is Soviet, right? It's not a Jewish memorial. It's not a Western European memorial. It is a Soviet marker, because the Soviets were the ones that pushed from the east, right, and liberated the camps, actually. So it's a marker of Soviet conquest of the land. And when you line up all of the most of the places in Poland where these atrocities occurred, the early memorials were all Soviet, and they mark them very differently than other Western European countries, and certainly the way that Jewish people do it, which is to remember names. Yeah.
If I could back up just a
Sure.
little bit. We only know about the really big ones, because as I discovered, what struck me when I visited the memorial for the murdered Jews, Berlin, and the inside museum, of looking at some of the displays, a lot of the big camps had satellite camps.
That's right. There were,
Where they killed, and they're nameless to us now. And where they killed less people, but still killed people. And then there was just camps scattered all over Eastern Europe. And I'd never heard these names before, and I read a lot about World War II. So that in itself is a form of liberation, right?
that's right. The number, I'm glad you brought that up about the subcamps, because the number that I have been actually not taught, but discussed, and when we're talking about this, is probably about 44,000 camps. That if you add all what Craig was talking about, if you add all the camps up, it would be about 44,000, and they're still discovering them today. I went to one last summer when I went to Sobibor, right, which is another one you don't hear much about, but there was a sub camp, a very small one, where they are still finding remains. And of course, there's archaeologists that work, right, in all of these. They have commissions to work and to find. And the thing that they had found, which was probably the most chilling thing I've seen, like to be able to see it, is that the bones of the survivors of these very small subcamps, of course, most of them are in forests because you can get away with it, you can hide in forest. The bones were actually found inside the trees, as if the trees were absorbing the remains, which was interesting to think about nature holding the body. Really, really eerie, fascinating all at the same time. But at any rate, this idea of denial, erasure. The other thing that is not all that well known, but you may have heard of it, is the attempt to erase the Jewishness of Jesus. There was a whole commission in Nazi Germany, the whole institute of de-Judification, and it included ways in which the Bible itself should be de-Judaized. So if you think about getting rid of all Jewish references, all references to Jewish people, Jews of any type in scripture, what do you have left?
It's a very small book.
It's a really small book. All right, you're talking about certainly all of the Old Testament, right? But if you're talking about Jesus, you've got a real problem. And so one of the ways to do it was to turn Jesus into the ideal Aryan, right? And so you have to get rid of all the miracles. You have to get rid of the Jewish background, and you have to turn Jesus into a mythological Aryan figure, right? There's a whole bunch of shenanigans you've got to go through to get there. This book, The Aryan Jesus by Susanna Heschel, is, you can get it off of Amazon. It's an excellent book. She is the one who pioneered this study. I've heard her speak, and you can just listen for hours. I mean, but what's interesting about that, and I first ran into this as an Old Testament scholar looking up the history of interpretation, which is part of my doctoral studies, right, of certain passages. And we run into this kind of thing because where does the last 200 years of scholarship on scripture, particularly Old Testament, where did it classically come out of? Germany, right? All the big scholars are German, right? Who developed all the theories. And so you've got the anti-Semitism that made its way into the Holocaust has been there for centuries, right? It's not anything new. But it's woven its way. So I was really struck when one day, now this has been several years ago, I picked up a hymnal, one of our old, not here, but one of the hymnals I used as a kid. And I wasn't looking for anything, I was just flipping through it. And I ran across, because a lot of our hymns were borrowed from writers that go back, and I found this one hymn that aligned almost exactly with with the way in which Jesus was recast as an Aryan. And I went back and did some history on this. I did not like what I found. But you may remember this hymn. It was called The Great Physician. Well, that was one of the techniques, right? You can't have Jesus as a miraculous healer, but you can have Jesus as a sympathizing physician.
Why?
Hmm?
Why is that?
Well, because the miraculous in the Nazi way of thinking can't exist. Right? It's the miraculous that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get rid of anything miraculous. It all has to be reduced to something you can see, think, prove. Of course, the irony of it is that by the time you turn Jesus into an Aryan, you've already appealed to myths that go back into Russian history and all. I mean, none of it works, right? But it was still an attempt to erase, right? So what I want us to think about today is, given all of that, where are some places that can be a bit problematic if we actually are looking through this lens? Where do we see an attempt to erase something? Right? Yeah, John?
Long hair, blue-eyed, white-skinned Jesus.
Yeah, that's a real problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it there. Mhm. Yeah, and that we have European art to thank for that,
Yeah.
because Jesus
Yeah, the Renaissance was really good at that.
was really good at that, right? And that's another, I mean, this is sort of a subject for another class. But it's actually kind of funny when you think about it. what is probably the most famous, one of the most famous statues of a biblical figure in Western art? The David, right? Michelangelo's David. What's wrong with that statue?
He's Italian.
He's Italian.
He's a tall attack.
He's a tall, muscular Italian European. What else is wrong with it? If he's supposed to be Jewish, he's not circumcised. You've got a Greek body on display, and this is, you see what I'm saying? I mean, again, erasing, right? Any time, and it's so subtle, anytime we think of the Old Testament as primarily a Christian document, we're erasing the Jewishness of it. We don't mean to, right? But if it's sort of like what happens in a lot of schools, right? Again, very subtle, happens in seminaries. I watched it happen in where I taught previously to coming here, is when you do biblical studies, it used to be that you had to take Greek and Hebrew, right? And then it was only Greek. Why? Because, well, you don't really need to study the Old Testament. What's really important is Jesus, and that's the New Testament. So you don't, you see what I'm doing? Right? But you need foreign language, so we'll do Greek and Spanish. I'm all for Spanish, right? But I mean, these are these little things that happen, right? To where we get away from the origins. So anyway, don't want to get off too much on that. But I do want to bring up two stories, the flood and the story of Isaac and Ishmael.
Oh,
Just
let you know, Kathy had her hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I was just bringing up the passages in Exodus and everywhere where, you know, the Israelites are supposed to go in and eradicate
Yes.
other people.
Mhm.
It's-
No, and that's something we're going to talk about next week.
Okay.
Right, but that's a problem.
Yeah.
What I'd like to sort of touch a little bit on this morning are two stories where you've got eradication problems, right? One is the flood, and the other one is the story of Isaac and Ishmael. Right? And I'll show what I'm talking about there. In the flood, though, what you've got is, well, actually, sorry, let me back up. The thing that kind of mediates against the erasure or the denial or the eradication is the fact that the story is preserved, right? Unlike what you see in Holocaust type events and genocides, there's an attempt to erase or deny that something happened, right? You get rid of all the evidence. What scripture does, for example, with the flood, it tells you exactly what happened. There's no erasing of the event, right? And not only is there no erasing of the event, but the actual story that's in scripture, right? Genesis 6-9 is actually two accounts of the flood that are woven together. I think I talked a little bit about this a couple of lessons ago. You can actually pull them apart, and you have a very old story and then a very a more, I don't want to call it a legal story, but it's more rooted in in laws and numbers and things that go along with legal text, which comes from a later period. But you've got two things that are woven together. So the other thing that you've got that we sometimes don't notice is that what comes before and after, right? What bookends the story of the flood? Well, Genesis chapter 5 is a genealogy. Genesis chapter 10 is a genealogy, right? The attempt to deny, for example, in the Holocaust was an attempt to eradicate not only the Jews from the planet, but also their memory, also their history, also their religion, get rid of it. So there's no evidence of it at all, right? The Jews were to be eradicated completely from the planet, right? It's not the case in Scripture because the genealogy, what that does, it's not just so and so begat so and so begat so and so, right? But it's there as a record of the names of people that they existed, right? The blessing to be fruitful and multiply is also in Genesis chapter 5, and it's also repeated in Genesis 9, right? That humanity is good is affirmed on either side of this flood story, right? So it's while it's still problematic, you've got things in scripture that guard against a view that God was against humanity itself, right? God desires the goodness of humanity from Genesis 1. It's repeated in Genesis 5. You have the flood. It's repeated in Genesis 9. And then you have what's called the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, which talks about the continuance of humanity, right? So that kind of mediates against, the destruction in Genesis 9. There's also the blessing, right? That's given. There's a covenant that's made at the end of Genesis 9 after the flood, which is what? Well, the first covenant we've got. The rainbow, right? And the promise is the world never destroy the earth again, right? That term rainbow comes from it's a Hebrew term that means the actual bow and arrow, right? So it's not just pretty colors, right? It's actually the symbol of a weapon. And it's a reminder that God will not weaponize nature, right, against humans, is kind of the way that metaphor works. Yeah.
You feel like the promise is specific, because I've always heard people, you will not destroy the world by water.
By water.
Mhm.
And should we think of it more broadly, or does the language tend to say, no, he didn't promise everything, he just promised not by water?
I think I actually think, given the language in the later prophets about the coming of the new heaven and the new earth, right, it really means everything, right? That there is a way in which even in the Isaiah view, and I'm sort of sticking with the Old Testament, that there is going to be there'll be a new heaven and a new earth. It's something we can't fully see, but that all creation will be brought together. So that's kind of how I see that particular thing. Yeah, Scott?
Over and over again in the Old Testament, there are these things of God starting over. Things have gotten so bad that I'm just going to start over. And this is one of those stories. And I can't think of a story that actually ends well where that is the stated intent. And in this case, they literally get off the boat and they screw it up again almost immediately. So, I'm just, it's one of the most confounding things to me that the stated intent of starting over, if that's not the intent, what is the intent?
Well, okay, hope I don't get in trouble here. But in the Jewish thought, I'm going to go start there. In the Jewish thought of all of this, it really is the idea of God as an ongoing creator, there's an ongoing working out of this human divine relationship. Right. And it's both sides have to work at it. Right. God's got things God's got to do, humans got things human has to do. And it's the covenant functions to keep it all together, and the promise keeps it all together. Right. So that what God started, I think the whole point of Christ coming, right? There's that phrase in Romans, that God brings, God and God's righteousness brings the justice through Christ, and Christ becomes the one that absorbs the sin, of the wrongdoing. And so now with Christ present in the world, this all has a chance again, right? It's the second time. So, that Ephesians passage in chapter 3 that talks about the eternal purpose of God was to show God's wisdom to the rulers in the heavenly places, right? That somehow in this human divine relationship, we are a visual aid to the heavenly realms of the myriad facets of God's wisdom, which is beyond me to understand, right? But somehow I think if we can let God be in process with the creation and with people, that's kind of actually what's happening. That it's not a matter of, it hasn't gotten fixed. It hasn't reached its fulfillment yet. We're still in the middle of it. All right. We saw kind of what happened when it started, and we're in a different spot now because of Christ, and we're looking forward to what's going to come next. Right. So we're sort of sitting in the middle with this, and we've got the backwards and we've got the forward look. It's sort of like going to New York and Los Angeles and you're in Kansas. You're not in New York anymore, but you're looking forward to the beach in California, right? Does that make sense? Okay, let me just do one more thing, because I do want to talk about, and if we don't finish this week, I'll finish it next week. I want to talk about Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac and Ishmael is one of the brother stories in Genesis. And let's just name the brother stories. First one is Cain and Abel. Second one, Ishmael, Isaac, and then Jacob and Esau, and then Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
All the rest.
That's right.
And those other guys.
Yeah, all those, and then you've got Joseph. Okay, let's look at the older brothers. Cain, Ishmael, Esau, Joseph's brothers. In the world of the ancient Near East, particularly in a patriarchal society, there's a thing called primogeniture, which are the rights of the firstborn, right? All of these guys at the top should be the ones getting the favor because they're the oldest. But who winds up being the favored? And by favored, I mean chosen for some purpose. It's all right, Abel, right? Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, right? So you have the stories in Genesis are working actually to subvert the current culture, right? The same thing happens with women. And I stand on this, even though people disagree with me. I think that a reading of the Old Testament with this kind of view in mind shows that women, not men, women keep the story going. Right? If you left it up to the men, you wouldn't really have story. But it's the women who actually are working to keep things going. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but the story is still moving forward. All right. So in the story of Ishmael and Isaac, you have Sarah who has an idea about how for Abraham or to have the child, right? It's through the maidservant Hagar, who's an Egyptian. She has the child, right? Hagar has Ishmael, which is technically who? Abraham's firstborn. It's logical in the culture for Abraham to assume that Ishmael's going to have the blessing. As soon as that happens, that's Genesis 16. Yes? Go ahead.
Now, maybe this was after this time, but it was my understanding that you're not Jewish unless your mother is Jewish. In modern
Well,
times, but.
Yeah, that's going to come
That's-
later, right? At this point, remember, at the point of Genesis, there is no Levitical law. 10 Commandments don't exist, right? This is all before that. So it's logical for him to assume that. Genesis 17 comes along. Abraham kind of argues, oh, can't Ishmael be the son? And God says, no, it's going to be Isaac. So then we have Isaac who is born, right? And then there is this scene in Genesis 22 where Sarah gets upset with him again and she throws Hagar and Ishmael out. In both cases, 16 and 17, Abraham does nothing to stop it. Right? So you have Isaac who's now on the scene. Now, the fact that Isaac is on the scene and gets the blessing, it's not Ishmael's fault. Right? But yet Ishmael is the one who's sent away. Right? And in the story, right, twice, Ishmael is removed from our view so that we see Isaac. Right? Where this gets interesting is the beginning of Genesis 22, which is where it's the Akedah, right? The story of the binding of Isaac, where God ask Abraham to sacrifice Isaac and take him up on the mountain, right? And then there are these words, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. Side note, burnt offering in Greek is what word? Holocaust, which is, right? So just park that. And on the mountain that I shall show you, this term, your only son, comes up again in verse 12 after the angel intervenes. So it's repeated. It comes at the start and at the end. Again, we know as readers that Isaac isn't the only son. So what is this business about your only son, Isaac? Well, it's one of these, it's a literary thing in a way, it's a story. But again, it's pushing Ishmael out. Like we're not supposed to see Ishmael, but he's still there. So what do we do with this? Well, what I would argue is happening is that the story itself of Ishmael and Hagar, the story itself is the testimony to their existence, right? They're not erased because we know about them, right? If you were to take the story of Abraham, you could very easily omit these stories, and you wouldn't have there wouldn't be a plot change, right? You just have Abraham in time, Sarah and Abraham in time at God's provision has Isaac, and then God tests Isaac. You can do that and go on, right? But the story of Ishmael doesn't really do anything to the story, right? Other than complicate it a little bit. But what I would argue happens in these brother stories is that they're ultimately about reconciliation, right? How do you have two brothers or groups of brothers? How is it that they eventually come together, right? And I think the stories are there to help us see that that's the point. So where do Ishmael and Isaac eventually come together? They do. It's in one verse, right? It's like it's kind of buried in there, but it's when Abraham dies in Genesis 25, Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury him. Right. Yeah, Aaron?
But in chapter 21, it's just one verse, but God also promises to make a great nation out of Ishmael.
That's right. And
So-
that doesn't go away.
Right. So, I mean, it's just that God's plan is for this to happen. And you took a side road. Now we've got to get back on track.
Mhm.
But since I kept the promise that all of that Abraham, all of Abraham's seed
Keep
will
going.
become a great nation, so will Ishmael.
Mhm. So now, what do we have? Let's just sort of stop there. That's absolutely right. God sees, even though in some ways Isaac is put in front of us. Look at Isaac, look at Isaac, look at Isaac. He's the son of the promise. Ishmael is not, he's over here. But the stories tell us God blessed both. The stories are the testimony to the existence of both, right? Now, you've got a competition, right? Which we see to this day. Now, here's where I want to, this is why it's important to go through this exercise, even though we kind of all know this. Is there a way in which the way we classically teach and look at these stories sort of very subtly teach us that if God favors a particular person, that we're supposed to favor that person and forget about the others? Now, why do I say that? Well, because Cain is typically vilified, right? Joseph's brothers are typically vilified. Esau never gets his fair due. And I'm thinking about the humanity of these people, right? And very few people that are not in either Jewish or Muslim circles even know about Ishmael. They never talk about it. So one of the other ways in which I think this plays out on the international stage, right, is that the literal territory that's being fought over right now, right, the whole Israel, Gaza, Palestine, all of that goes back to these stories, right? I mean, these stories are the roots of these kinds of conflicts, right? And one of the things that happens, and I'm saying this as an observation, not as a judgment, it's just an observation, is that when you have a group of people, like when I was at the International Association of Genocide Scholars in South Africa last October, there was a room full of people from all over the world, including Iran, including Palestine, including Pakistan, including Israel, right? All were there in this big room like this. And one of the things that happens, and it was actually called out in public, which was really nerve-wracking to be in the middle of, but fascinating to watch, is that when you're in a setting, a political setting, while and discussing these kinds of issues, you have people who think that once you bring up the Holocaust, it sucks all the air out of the room. Right? The Jewish people get all the attention. Israel gets all the attention because that's why Israel exists in 1947, right? And so you have all this attention on Israel to the exclusion of everything happening on the other side. In other words, all the attention is on Isaac and no one's thinking about Ishmael. Now, that's not necessarily true, but in the dynamics of how these two things work, it happens. And so really the lesson comes down to something really simple. It's not simple, but conceptually, we have to keep both people in view. Does that make sense? Yeah.
A couple years ago, we were doing, Let's Start Talking program, and I got assigned to a woman, which we became good friends, but she was from Saudi Arabia and was a very devout Muslim. And as we went through the stories, the book of Luke, we ended up talking about Ishmael. And she told me that the story that they have in the Quran, or the story of this, is much more developed. There was all these side stories, and it was all fleshed out, and it was like a major story that we seems like we only get a fraction of it. So I wondered if, and I'm thinking about it, like, well, if that is history developed, by the time that story was written, where along the way with the story that's in the Quran, how was that written? How was that developed? Or was they fleshed it out, or is it that story had already existed throughout the years, just like the stories of, as we know of them, as Isaac existed all these years, before they all got written down.
That's a really great question, because the Quran doesn't come along until several hundred years after you have the Hebrew Bible written. But what's really important to keep in mind is that the canon, that we have, took hundreds of years to get finalized in the version that we have it. And so even, for example, it's that kind of a study or history of how those parallel traditions developed. They probably developed in parallel, but then you've still got this favoritism of, we're going to spend more time developing our view of it, and we're not going to engage the other. And so then you get these splits, right? Which would have happened, right? And I know we're way out of time. I'm sorry.
This is so amazing. Thank you so much. One thing that's really struck me is, we flannel graphed all of these stories for the sake of young children who probably shouldn't hear the R-rated version of it. But we never went back to the R-rated version for everybody else as adults.
Exactly.
And
yes.
And to me, and it causes a lot of psychic discomfort to think about all these conflicts and how but we think of those conflicts as something that we shouldn't, we know what the conclusion is. We shouldn't bother people with all the messy stuff in between. And the whole point is it's not it's not a bug, it's a feature. The conflict is a part of understanding all of this. And if we want to bring this into modern times, our inability or our unwillingness to think about really messy parts of American history is a huge disservice to everyone, including future generations.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we will continue. Got one more. Take another week. Okay.